London in the early years of the 19th century wore its beauty like a well-trained smile, gracious at a distance, merciless upon approach. In a narrow street not far from Grosvenor Square stood the Duke's townhouse, its brick warmed by spring sun and its windows forever watchful. Roses climbed the iron railings, their scent mingling with coal smoke and carriage dust, while inside, servants spoke softly, for even whispers could wound in a house governed by rank. Elsinore entered that house as one enters a church after loss, with humility, composure, and a silence shaped by necessity. She was 23, possessed of a beauty that did not announce itself but lingered, and an intelligence sharpened by early education and later hardship. Born to gentle means now eroded by death and debt, she had learned to stitch not merely cloth, but dignity into every seam. Her hands were steady, her posture unyielding, and her eyes observant without impertinence. She asked little, accepted much, and trusted no kindness that came too easily. The Duke who employed her was 26 and already practiced in restraint. He had inherited title and responsibility together, and bore both with scrupulous honesty. Society praised his uprightness, his refusal of excess, his distance from scandal. He was handsome in a classical way, his expressions controlled, his manners impeccable, yet those closest to him knew the cost of such discipline. Duty had become his language, and caution his companion. In his world, affection was permitted only after assurance, and trust only after proof. Elsinore was hired discreetly, introduced as a temporary seamstress whose presence need not trouble visitors or invite comment. She worked in a small room near the back of the house, mending riding coats frayed by use and waistcoats dulled by seasons of wear. The Duke encountered her only in passing, offering nods of acknowledgement without inquiry. At first, her quiet efficiency pleased him, for it asked nothing and disrupted nothing. Yet it was precisely her unassuming grace that unsettled others. Servants began to watch her more closely than necessary. A lady's maid lingered too long near her doorway. A footman repeated, with embellishment, how the Duke had paused once to speak with her about thread. Such moments, innocent in truth, grew elaborate in retelling. London thrived on speculation, and the idea that a woman of uncertain standing might harbor ambition was irresistible. By the time the murmurs reached the Duke, they had sharpened into accusation. He summoned Elsinore one afternoon when the light slanted coldly through tall windows and the house seemed to hold its breath. She stood before him with her hands folded, her chin level, already aware that dignity could provoke offense as easily as deference. He spoke without cruelty but without softness, his words chosen to end the matter rather than explore it. He told her that her conduct, though outwardly proper, had invited misinterpretation. Then, with the finality of a man accustomed to obedience, he said, "You are not wife material. I hired you only to mend my clothes." The sentence fell between them like a verdict. Elsinore did not plead, nor did she protest. Her face revealed nothing beyond a brief tightening at the corners of her mouth, as if she had pressed pain inward rather than allowed it air. She inclined her head and acknowledged his authority, though something irrevocable settled behind her eyes. In that moment, she understood precisely how she was seen and how narrow the space allowed her to exist. When she returned to her workroom, the house resumed its ordinary rhythms, yet she felt herself altered. Shame did not break her, but it clarified her position. She would remain only as long as necessity demanded, and she would give no one cause to believe she desired more than honest labor. Still, as evening drew in and lamps were lit, the Duke found his thoughts returning, unbidden, to the woman whose silence had unsettled him more than any argument. Something had been said that could not be recalled, and though the house slept, the consequence of that moment had only begun. Beyond her door, Elsinore paused before setting needle to cloth, steadying herself with a breath she could not afford to waste on grief. Survival, she reminded herself, had always required endurance. Yet beneath that resolve stirred a quieter resolve still, one that did not yet name itself. In the Duke's chamber, he stood longer than necessary by the window, watching the garden darken, uneasy with the sense that he had dismissed something rare under the weight of habit. Neither understood that the smallest tear, once hidden in a seam, might alter the entire garment if handled with care, and that fate, like fabric, often revealed its strength only when tested. Spring, patient and watchful, waited silently. Days passed in the Duke's house with the deceptive calm of a river that hides its current beneath reflected sky. Elsinore resumed her work with the same precision as before, though the ease had left her movements, replaced by a careful economy that allowed no gesture to be misread. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her gaze lowered, and made herself smaller than her nature demanded. Yet the Duke, despite his resolve, found his attention drawn to her presence more often than he wished to admit. Spring deepened outside, softening the city's sharp edges. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, catching dust motes and illuminating the quiet industry of the household. The Duke spent long hours managing correspondence and accounts, for the estate's finances weighed heavily upon him. He prided himself on stewardship, believing a title meaningless if it failed those who depended upon it. It was during one such morning, burdened by ledger books and anxious calculations, that he sent for Elsinore with a request that carried unspoken significance. He placed before her an ancestral riding coat, dark with age and carefully preserved. It had belonged to his father, and before him, generations of men who had worn responsibility as visibly as fabric. The lining had torn, and the Duke insisted the repair be done privately, beyond the scrutiny of other hands. Elsinore accepted the garment with quiet gravity, sensing its importance not merely as clothing, but as symbol. Trust, however limited, had been offered, and she did not take it lightly. She worked upon the coat over several evenings, the lamplight revealing the careful architecture of its construction. As she loosened the damaged lining, her fingers brushed against something stiff and unfamiliar. Within the seam, concealed with deliberate care, lay folded papers browned with time. Elsinore froze, her breath shallow, aware that discovery alone could condemn her. Yet her curiosity, tempered by conscience, urged her onward. She unfolded the documents and read, slowly and thoroughly, for she had been taught that understanding was a responsibility. The letters and accounts spoke of deception practiced not by strangers, but by blood. A trusted relation had siphoned funds, misdirected rents, and masked losses with false entries. The estate, already strained, stood on the brink of collapse, and the tenants, unseen yet vulnerable, would bear the cost. Elsinore's hands trembled, not with fear for herself, but with the weight of what she now knew. To return the papers unnoticed would preserve her safety. To reveal them would invite suspicion and perhaps ruin. For a night and a day, she carried the knowledge in silence, moving through the house as though bearing a secret fire beneath her calm exterior. The servants' glances sharpened, gossip finding new fuel in her reserve. A rumor spread that she had been dismissed once already, another that she lingered only by the Duke's indulgence. Each whisper tested her resolve. She understood, too, well, how easily truth could be twisted, especially when spoken by a woman without protection. At last, Elsinore made her decision. She repaired the coat with flawless care, restoring its strength without visible mark, then placed the discovered papers inside a separate envelope. Her accompanying letter was written plainly, without accusation or appeal, stating only what she had found and why she believed it mattered. She signed her name with steady hand, neither apologizing nor excusing herself. When the coat was returned, she requested nothing in return, not even assurance. The Duke received the garment at night, after the house had quieted and the city's clamor had softened to distant echo. He recognized immediately the excellence of the repair, yet it was the envelope that arrested him. As he read, the room seemed to contract, shadows deepening around the edges of his vision. Each line confirmed what he had long feared but refused to name. Betrayal, intimate and calculated, stood revealed by the hands he had most underestimated. He remained awake until dawn, pacing, reading, rereading, his certainty dissolving into sober clarity. By morning, gratitude warred with shame, for the woman he had dismissed as unsuitable had proven herself indispensable. Yet even as resolve hardened within him, Elsinore prepared quietly for departure, folding her few belongings with practiced efficiency. She had done what conscience demanded, and whatever followed lay beyond her control. As she closed her door for the last time, the house held its breath again, poised on the edge of consequence, while truth waited, patient as stitched cloth, for the courage to be worn. Outside, the garden stirred with birds and pale blossoms, indifferent to human turmoil. Somewhere between those walls, a reckoning gathered strength, unseen but inevitable. What had been hidden for years now pressed forward, demanding acknowledgement, and neither silence nor rank would be sufficient to contain it any longer. At last, morning entered the house with a hesitant light, as though aware that something irrevocable had occurred before dawn. The Duke sent for Elsinore at once, not through a servant's casual message, but by written summons, precise and unmistakable. She read it without visible reaction, though her heart struck sharply, and followed its instruction with the calm of one long accustomed to consequence. He stood when she entered, an uncharacteristic gesture that unsettled her more than severity would have done. The papers lay on his desk, neatly ordered, no longer hidden, no longer denied. For a moment neither spoke, the silence charged not with accusation, but with reckoning. At last he addressed her by name, carefully, as if learning its weight. He told her that what she had uncovered was true, and that the damage, though grave, had been contained because she had chosen to speak. Elsinore listened without triumph, her hands folded before her, as they had been on the day of her humiliation. She answered only when asked, clarifying dates, explaining how she had found the documents, never once presenting herself as savior. When he asked why she had not protected herself by silence, she met his gaze steadily and replied that some costs were greater than dismissal. The simplicity of her words stripped the room of pretense. The Duke felt the full measure of his earlier judgment settle upon him, heavy and deserved. He acknowledged his error plainly, without softening it through circumstance. He told her he had mistaken restraint for calculation and dignity for ambition, and that his words to her had been unjust. It was not an apology shaped to preserve authority, but one offered with a risk of rejection. Elsinore received it quietly, though her breath caught before she mastered it. In that moment, roles shifted almost imperceptibly. He was no longer merely the arbiter of her fate, and she no longer merely subject to it. They spoke then of matters beyond the immediate crisis, of education, of loss, of the careful decisions made by those who could not afford mistakes. Elsinore revealed, without ornament, the life she had led since fortune had failed her family, and the vow she had made never to seek advantage through affection. The Duke listened with an attention that surprised them both. Yet the world beyond the room did not pause for understanding. The scandal could not be contained indefinitely, and the exposure of betrayal would invite scrutiny upon everyone involved. He told her that her presence in the house would soon be questioned, and that protection, once withheld, would be difficult to extend without consequence. His concern was evident, but so was his uncertainty, for the solution required more than authority. Elsinore considered this without fear. She said she would leave if asked, for she had never belonged to the house, nor wished to compromise him further. Her voice held neither resentment nor plea, only resolve. The Duke found this unbearable, not because he desired her absence, but because he recognized how easily he had assumed she would endure whatever was required of her. He surprised himself by asking her to remain, not as an employee under suspicion, but as someone whose counsel he trusted. The offer was tentative, its boundaries undefined, yet it acknowledged her worth in a manner no title could confer. Elsinore hesitated, aware of the risk, yet equally aware that retreat would offer no shelter from rumor. She agreed, on the condition that she remain by choice, not convenience. When she left the room, The Duke remained standing, conscious that something essential had shifted within him. The house felt altered, as if its walls had absorbed a truth long resisted. Elsinore returned to her room, not to pack, but to sit quietly by the window, watching the city resume its careless motion. Between them lay an understanding still unnamed, fragile yet persistent, like a thread drawn tight enough to hold, but not yet tested. Outside, the bells of the city marked the hour, indifferent to private transformation, while within, two lives paused on the threshold of irrevocable change, neither retreating, neither advancing, held fast by the knowledge that dignity, once recognized, could not be unseen again. The decision did not grant them peace, only direction. Both understood that acknowledgement was not resolution, and that society would demand explanations neither was prepared to offer. Yet beneath restraint stirred a cautious hope, disciplined but undeniable, that truth, once spoken, altered the future's shape. As Elsinore extinguished her lamp, and the Duke finally sat, each sensed that endurance alone would no longer suffice. Something finer had been required and given, and the cost of denying it again would be far greater. Their silent resolve settled like evening dust, unseen, inescapable, patient, binding past and future together irrevocably. The reckoning arrived without spectacle, carried instead by documents, signatures, and the slow turning of public opinion. The Duke exposed the betrayal with measured resolve, refusing to shield blood at the expense of duty. Accounts were corrected, leases secured, and those who depended upon the estate were spared the ruin that had hovered unseen. Society murmured, then listened, impressed by the firmness of his conduct, though curiosity sharpened toward the quiet woman whose proximity to the matter could not be ignored. Elsinore moved through the days with composed restraint, neither hiding nor asserting herself. Invitations ceased, then cautiously resumed, framed with polite uncertainty. Some saw her as fortunate, others as dangerous, yet none could dismiss her entirely. The Duke observed this scrutiny with growing clarity, recognizing how easily a reputation might be shaped by assumption alone. What unsettled him most was not society's judgment, but his own delayed understanding of her cost. Their conversations continued, brief yet deliberate, often in the garden where roses now bloomed without restraint. There, beneath open sky, formality softened, though neither spoke of affection. He sought her counsel on matters of estate and conscience, valuing her clarity. She answered honestly, never presuming authority, yet never shrinking from conviction. Trust, once earned, deepened into something quieter and more perilous. It was society, relentless in its appetite for definition, that forced the moment. A gathering at the townhouse brought whispers to the surface, glances lingering too long, questions shaped as compliments. Elsinore endured them with calm grace until the weight became intolerable. That evening, she told the Duke she would depart, not in anger, but in preservation of both their standings. Her decision was gentle, yet final. He followed her into the garden at dusk, the air heavy with scent and unspoken consequence. There, stripped of witnesses, he spoke not as Duke, but as man, abandoning caution. He told her that his house had become empty without her presence, that her courage had redefined his understanding of worth, and that he could no longer pretend indifference without betraying himself. His voice did not rise, but it carried the force of truth long resisted. Elsinore listened, her composure faltering at last. She reminded him of the world they inhabited, of the cost such a union would exact, of how easily affection could become burden. He answered simply that rank without integrity was already a burden, and that life, once measured only by obligation, had revealed its poverty. Then he asked her to stand with him, not in service, but in equal regard. The question was not framed as rescue, nor as defiance, but as choice. Elsinore felt the full weight of it settle within her. She thought of endurance, of silence, of the careful life she had constructed to survive. Then she accepted, not with triumph, but with quiet certainty, knowing that dignity, once recognized, demanded courage to claim. Their marriage followed without extravagance, witnessed by those who understood that restraint could hold more meaning than spectacle. The ceremony took place beneath open spring light, vows spoken with deliberate calm. Elsinore wore no jewels beyond her bearing, and the Duke no expression beyond solemn devotion. Society observed, some in approval, others in disbelief, yet none could deny the coherence of the union. In time, the house grew warm with purpose. Elsinore became its steady center, her intelligence shaping decisions, her compassion guiding tradition toward mercy. The Duke learned that leadership need not be solitary, and that love, once feared as distraction, refined as resolve. Together they walked the gardens in the long evenings, their steps unhurried, their conversation unguarded. The city continued in all its beauty and cruelty, yet within their walls, something enduring had been stitched into place. What began as humiliation had yielded understanding. What was dismissed as unsuitable had proven essential. Spring matured into summer, roses fell and returned, and the seam once torn held firm. Their story, unremarkable in spectacle yet profound in consequence, endured not because it defied society, but because it reminded it, quietly, of what worth truly meant.